is Lindsay Banner, and I am here with Josh Arndt from Municap. And to give you a little bit of basis about what we do in our expertise, I think is necessary as we dive into this. So our team is a municipal finance public consulting firm. So we specialize in working with the development community and municipalities to facilitate public-private partnerships to finance roads, water, sewers, through bond issuances, and that are secured and repaid with special assessments or incremental tax revenue that we'll talk about here in today's presentation. And then on the back end, because these are municipal bond transactions, they are regulated by the Securities Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service, and so they're subject to monitoring and reporting on an annual basis. Typically, municipal bonds are 30 years, so the time in which we act as administrator on the bonds is 30 years. So I work on, we're divided into two areas and divisions at Municap. Half of us are origination, so structuring those deals with the development and municipality, understanding how much we can finance, how much the revenues are available, and accessing the capital markets. And then once the bonds close, we've got an entire administrative division that then works to ensure the monitoring and reporting is completed, and Josh works then directly with these municipalities who've issued the bonds and the homeowners that live in these communities that are subject to the additional tax burden or tax levy that are used to then repay the debt. So I wanted to give that little background before we really dive in today's presentation called Alphabet Soup, Special District Financing and the Impact of Residential Homeowners. So if I can, let's see, I'm terrible with clickers, I'm just qualifying that now. Okay, sorry there. So I was given 4 acronyms when the team here at the Collin County Association of Realtors reached out to me to address today. And so a raise of hands, how many of you have worked within a community, sold a home within with a property that's subject to one of these acronyms? Okay, very good. Can I ask for a show of hands, how many of those were MUDs? And how many were PIDs? Okay, so.
Oh, what's that? Yeah, I did a PID.
Okay, yeah. Very good. So, as we go through this, I know one of the questions we're often asked, because our firm, though we've got an office here in Irving, Texas, and Houston, we work in 30 states in the District of Columbia. We're a small shop. There's 35 of us total now. But we do see national and local best practice. And one of the things that we've seen is a true, consistent, not marginal, but incremental and exponential increase in the use of special district financing, so these tools. And the question often becomes, well, why? And I think why you're seeing more of this prevalently, both locally and nationally, is the fact that the cities are having an extreme amount of growth, and they don't have, whether they're small communities that are receiving the benefit of the sprawl of Dallas out into the counties, or whether it is the urban centers, these cities simply do not have the general fund revenues to provide the infrastructure that we're used to receiving as citizens. And similarly, they want to expand their tax base. So they don't want to miss out on the opportunity for growth, but they also need help in doing that. So hence the rationale for a public-private partnership, which is what the majority of these are, and we will get into today. Typically, surprised to see as many MUDs as we did. We would see, historically, MUDs are Houston-centric with some PIDs, and on the reverse, we've seen a lot more utilization of PIDs in the DFW area versus MUDs, and that's simply due to the sheer number of incorporated municipalities in the DFW area that want to take care of and capture the growth that's happening here in Dallas. So they want to be in control of the public infrastructure going into their town, and we're going to talk about that today. So with that, let's see here. Okay. So there's 2 divisions of the types of acronyms that were initially listed between the PUD, the MUD, the PID, and the SUD. So the first one is the PUD, Planned Unit Development Purpose. So this one, contrary to the other 3 acronyms that we will hit on, are simply a zoning implementation tool. So it establishes a specific area that a development will be created, and that developer works with the municipality to truly understand what the uses are. So instead of being subject to multiple zoning districts within a defined area, they go in and understand as a single developer what they want this typically mixed-use development to be, so that they do not have to go in and get conditional uses and variances on each of the zoning types. So what it does is establishes a cohesive plan for a community, and it allows a city or a municipality, a county, depending on who oversees the zoning, to really achieve the goals in their comprehensive plan, so both the developer and the city know what the actual goals are.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Can we get these slides after that?
Oh yeah, absolutely, Chris. I believe that's going to be posted on the website.
Yes, just real quick. My business card is over here when you check out. I'll make sure I get you my information. You can just email me, and I will send you the.
Thank you.
Okay.
Because I can pay more attention if that.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay. So then a PUD implementation. So simply it's adopted by resolution or ordinance, whatever the local legislation requires, and then it adopts the overarching zoning guidelines for that area. So typically it requires the developer to meet with the municipality. It will be adopted at the pace at which the municipality is comfortable with what's being proposed to be included, and it's meeting the comprehensive plan goals and requirements. And at the end of the day, once it's adopted, then that master developer or any sub-developer is subject to those rules and overarching guidelines. So again, a very, at the end of the day, simple tool to overlay on any existing zoning. That trumps it. It now becomes the overarching guidelines for that area. So at the end of the day, the question I think is, well, what's the PUD impact to the homeowner? Essentially, because this is not a financing mechanism like the other three that we're going to talk about, it has no financial implication for that homeowner. What it does allow a homeowner to look at the adopted overlay and understand what is proposed for their area and what are the amenities or the commercial areas that are subject and supposed to be provided pursuant to that PUD. Now, there may be homeowner association fees incurred. However, that's simply a matter of that sub-developer who goes in, puts in the residential subdivision, and determines if they need to levy a homeowners association fee for their local amenities within that subdivision. So the latter part of this presentation, which I think often generates, oops, thanks Josh, more questions as it relates to homeowners, it's more ambiguous, is the MUD, PID, and SUD purpose. And so, because I'm used to doing the origination side, I'm going to give you guys a background on the purpose and the implementation, and then Josh is going to really delve into what do each of these three districts mean to a homeowner. So, the MUD, PID, and SUD purpose is they're all self-financing tools available to developers and municipalities to help encourage new economic development, to redevelop urban renewal areas, to rebuild public infrastructure, and to finance new public infrastructure. I would say here in the DFW market, we're seeing it utilized most prevalently for economic growth and new public infrastructure. The DFW area is simply growing with a number of new residents, quite frankly, and the expansion that all of these smaller municipalities that are growing want to capture that growth, again, and be in control of that. So they don't want to miss the bandwagon. They want to make sure that they can capture the new tax-based revenues and provide the infrastructure to allow for that growth to occur. So, you know, one great question that was asked right before we came on here, well, you know, how do these come to be? It's a developer typically that goes and approaches a municipality for this purpose, because these financial tools are an implementation tool. So it's a plan development, and this enables it to happen to help improve and increase the amount of capital raised to allow the development to go forward. In other words, this is a public-private partnership that without the public body getting involved and providing some kind of incentive package, the project would likely not go forward anyway. So does the city want to reap the benefits of an increased tax base? Yes. Do they want to be able to finance the public infrastructure that maybe is planned on their capital improvement plan, but it's 20 years down the road? And so this enables them to leverage private dollars to capture public money up front to provide for that service. So that being said, How it's financed is through an additional tax or special assessment that's placed on properties within the boundaries. So for each of these, the MUD, the PID, and the SUD, they are geographic boundaries that get established, and an additional burden, tax burden or assessment is borne by those property owners for over a period of time that then can be leveraged into a bond issuance or some funding mechanism to get money up front to pay for the infrastructure.
Is the time different on each of those?
Yes, great question. So we're going to get into the details associated with each of those because I think it's really very relevant to you guys into how that actually occurs and the differences. So the goal here is to describe how they're created, each of the qualities, and then how it impacts the homeowner, and then we'll do a wrap-up just to provide a grid as to the comparison to highlight and recapitulate what we've stated. So for MUD and SUD, a municipal utility district and a special utility district, they are actually created by legislation adopted by the state. So a developer goes to a city and says, we want to create this independent district. The city relinquishes that ETJ area, and then they go before the state legislature, so they could be created as frequently as every 2 years. So once that occurs, it does create an independent district that is managed by an appointed board. It is for a MUD and a SUD, it is no longer managed by the city, but by a board that is created for the purpose of that district. And then they're regulated by the Texas Commission of Environmental Quality. So on the contrary for PID, public improvement districts, they're created by resolution adopted by the local municipality. So they can be created as frequently as a municipality is educated and willing to create that through their standard legislative process. Typically, we see that a PID from inception to the time that we levy the assessment on the property happen as quickly as 4 to 6 months. And again, it's to establish that tax base within that municipality. And similar to the MUD and the SUD, it creates a geographic boundary on which this additional tax burden or assessment will be levied on, and Josh will be talking about that. And then it's governed by Chapter 372 of the Texas Local Government Code. So, I will now turn it over to Josh for him to dive into the impact to homeowners.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So, as Lindsay mentioned, she's much more on the front end origination. I handle much more post-issuance steps with each municipality. I deal a lot more directly with you all, your potential clients, home buyers, title companies, lenders, escrow agents across the board asking questions every day. What is this thing that we might have to pay? So I think it's going to be really beneficial just to kind of highlight some of those differences regarding each financing type and just questions that I think that'll be relevant to pass on to your clients. Just so that they can make that informed choice about how this may impact them once they're with that property and with that home. So in a MUD, typically that is going to be an ad valorem-based tax. And there are a few differences I'd like to highlight between a PID and a MUD. MUD is typically ad valorem-based, as I mentioned, and the term, the life cycle of it's undefined. And what I mean by that is it potentially could go on in perpetuity. It could be, dissolved, the debt paid off, annexed into a city or something like that, and it goes away. But it's not defined. It's gray. A PID has a defined shelf life. As Lindsay mentioned earlier, typically the debt is structured 25 to 30 years. So if we had a PID levy assessments in 2019, in 2049, that PID would go away. If it was paid off annually for that assessment. If there was an additional assessment to be levied, at that point, then it would have to go through the whole approval process again and get consent of homeowners for additional levy. Where, again, the MUD is just strictly ambiguous in that sense. Another key concept with a MUD, I think that's very important for peace of mind with property owners, is the concept of cross-collateralization. It sounds fancy, but all it basically means is in a MUD, that debt is general debt that those who can pay that debt have to pay. In a PID, you're assessed, let's just say $20,000 on that property. As long as you pay your annual installments through your property tax statements and pay that off annually, then there's no other implications. If your neighbor does not pay theirs in a PID, you're not affected. In a MUD, if I was a bad neighbor, was not able or did not pay my MUD tax, the following year likely those who could pay their MUD tax would go up because they have to cover that debt. Now on the back end of that, typically once that property that did not pay goes through the delinquency process or foreclosure, there may be a credit back to them in the future, but there's a lot more up and down with that. Whereas a PID, as long as I make my payment, you know, I'm in the clear as far as the PID is concerned.
So are the management fees on each of those different then, based on that, or?
Yes. That would just be, typically when it gets to delinquency foreclosure, that's kind of handled outside of the district, but managing and kind of informing those bodies that these properties still need to pay, that would be covered through the administrative process, yes.
So you can foreclose on that?
Yes. So with a PID, it is a first lien only superior by your traditional property taxes. So if someone's delinquent on their PID assessment, more than likely they're also going to be delinquent on all of their property taxes, and that would just follow through the traditional delinquency and foreclosure process. Some other items that I'd like to just kind of point out regarding the MUD is, so Lindsay mentioned that a MUD is its own political entity. Those citizens actually aren't citizens of maybe the nearby city. They're technically citizens of that MUD or that district. And because of that, they're not paying an additional city tax. They're just paying that MUD tax for that debt. However, because they're not citizens of that nearby city, the MUD typically would have to provide some means of providing public police, fire, safety services. So you're not just potentially paying for reimbursement of the public improvements in infrastructure, but also some public safety services. Sometimes the MUD may be able to enter into like an interlocal agreement with a nearby municipality, but again, that cost would be passed on to those property owners. We've also seen where the MUD just says, nope, we're not going to finance that, and that's okay. Then those public safety services would default to that respective county, but then you get into the fallback of their response times are much slower than their neighbors who are a citizen of the city, have a much quicker responses through their city safety services. So those are just some trade-offs that you might have to be mindful of with your clients when evaluating the process with a MUD.
So if a MUD is absorbed into the city at some point and becomes part of the city, do they still have to pay off that original bond, or is it just incremental?
So typically, in order for that process to occur, the debt will have to be paid off, or the city may take on the balance of the debt. So typically that MUD tax would go away. Now they're citizens of that municipality and be paying that respective city tax.
But you don't know that. Or
No, and I mean typically, and that's why
it's not defined if it's ever ending.
correct. That would
So
be.
it can go forever.
It could. It doesn't have to. There's nothing that says it will, but it can. It doesn't have a defined life.
Are there any MUDs that have had that happen that they have ended?
Yes, off the top of my head, I can't think of a specific example, but that certainly has occurred where the debt is paid off, that district is annexed into a city, and then
But that's not typical.
We honestly more in corporate or more not?
We would not be the ones to answer that, quite frankly. That's more managerial, and because they're independent districts, those independent districts have that information.
It seems to me that would keep it very hyper-local, but it can be a good thing, then you can be more in control of what kind of police and fire coverage you have and things like that, so.
Are you referring to a MUD?
Yeah.
Yeah, it could. You also have potentially, I think the counter, the flip side of that coin is that typically a MUD board is usually developer appointed, and they're a little more insulated, whereas with a PID, you have your city council is the one making those decisions, so if there's a problem or a disagreement or something like that, maybe amenities weren't built to what you thought they were supposed to be, you have those elected officials to help answer those and make those calls.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but say Salina Light Farms has a MUD, and if Salina were to incorporate that, let's say 18 years and it was a 20-year payoff, whatever, that means they're paying off the remaining 2 years and the MUD will go away, correct? If the city's incorporating them, correct? Okay, I just want to make sure I understood that correctly.
And so school districts overlap into MUDs, correct? And so when you pay your taxes, you pay your school tax, your property tax, but then you also pay your MUD tax.
Yes, and it's probably higher, much higher, sometimes 20–30% higher than the city tax in the same city, like 40, much higher.
And your county tax.
Yeah, you pay everything else.
Correct. So
Plus the MUD.
I guess kind of just with a MUD, typically you probably would not have that city tax. You'd have the MUD tax in place of it. With a PID, you would typically have you could have a city tax and the PID assessment on top of that. So
it's different.
And so our next slide, we're just talking quickly about the SUD impact. I think the easiest way to think of it, the SUD utility charge is just like a cable or an electric bill. It's just a monthly fee that's in addition to some of your other charges and taxes. So the MUD and the PID are billed and collected annually, typically through property, the respective county tax collector or tax assessment collector, and the SUD is billed monthly.
If I can make one addition to that one. So the MUD and the PID, which we're doing a little bit more of a comparison because they're analogous, right? They're centered around development, where a SUD, where it is an independent district that's created, it's solely being created to provide for a water line, a sewer line, or a water tower. And it's not just one geographic region or development, but rather a greater region that's serving multiple municipalities. So it's an additional charge for that. So it's not necessarily, though we were asked to talk about it today and we want to make sure we're hitting on that, it's not as in-depth and analogous to the PID and the MUD, just so that we're clear.
So regarding the PID, as I said, so as with the MUD being ad valorem based, as those changes in assessed value change, your property tax or that MUD tax could fluctuate. Sometimes the MUD tax rate may adjust each year and keep the amount billed, on a relatively level surface, but it can fluctuate. With a PID, typically what you'll see is that that principal balance that's assessed, that cannot increase. And then we typically have a 30-year projected schedule of annual installments that we provide out to property owners. And that's going to show you within probably about 90–95% certainty estimate of what that annual expense is going to be each year until that PID is paid off. And that's not impacted by changes in assessed value. So when a developer or a builder owned that, they would be paying, and they, let's just say they did not go forward with the community kind of as they intended, and they're stuck with those lots, they would be responsible for those same annual payments as a homeowner that has a fully improved value and a $300,000 or $400,000 homeowner. So those changes to assessed value don't change that projected schedule. Typically, the only changes are going to be to those administrative expense items that may fluctuate each year. And again, the check and balance is, as the administrator, we prepare those annual budgets, but they're reviewed by their respective municipalities' staff and ultimately have to be approved by council. So we don't have the ability to just insert, our cost of paper went up and pass all of that on. If it is going to increase or change from the original estimates, it can, but that's going to be vetted by the respective city before it ever gets passed on to a property owner. Again, just highlighting the term is defined for each phase. I think a very important item as well is in a PID, you have the ability to pay off that assessment at any point. We've seen that occur at closing. We've seen that occur, 5 years down the road. That's up to the respective property owner. And they have that ability to pay that off, and then they're saving all future interest and administrative expenses because they will not be billed an annual amount. Yes, ma'am.
But so if they sell the house and it's already been prepaid, then they're losing out on all that money.
Sure, that would be the risk.
What was the question?
So the question was if they make that prepayment in full and then they would sell the property, are they losing out on that money? Yes, that'd be the risk. That money is going to redeem either the bonds or the debt that was issued so that that property, has satisfied their obligation. Certainly, you could probably recoup some of that in the negotiation with the next buyer because you are saving them that annual expense. Would you be willing to recoup 100% of that? I'm not sure, but that would just be something, yes, you would not have a guarantee of that coming back to you.
So I'm familiar with this in the villages in Florida. My in-laws live there. And so they use that as a selling point. Oh, here's this property, it's great, and the bond is paid. And so, however you do the math on that, it can be used to your advantage.
Sure, I think, the main point I think I'd want to make about prepayments is that it's going to be very, owner, very property case specific. For some folks that think they may be in a home for 2 or 3 years and then they're moving on, that may not make a lot of sense. For someone that thinks or anticipates to be with a property, a lot longer, it could. So it's just going to be a case by case. But the key is in a MUD, because it's a general debt of the district, you cannot pay off, you cannot get out of the MUD. You are always, as long as that MUD tax is around, you're going to be subject to paying it. In the PID, once I've satisfied the principal portion, I would no longer be billed an annual amount.
One additional item to your comment is that, in theory, the sales prices of these homes, and Josh is, I think, going to dive into this a little bit more in a second, but it's typically a little bit less in a PID because how that developer financed that infrastructure was different than an adjacent property that does not have a PID. So in other words, the adjacent property, the developer can't get the city to buy into the public infrastructure and helping with them. And so they have to go finance that cost of the infrastructure in their conventional development construction loan. So therefore, that gets captured in the price that goes out to the end user. Where in a PID, they're able to bifurcate that. And so the cost of that infrastructure isn't in their conventional developer construction loan. And so that is placed into this PID. So to your point, you've got a cheaper sales price initially, and then you've got the delta between your neighbor and your property that is the assessment, because that's how we kind of work to size how much can that property bear. And so that delta becomes the principal portion that could be prepaid. So ultimately, when you're going to sell it, you would be selling it to factor in the cost of that assessment because it's receiving the benefit of that infrastructure. So in theory, you could sell it at that, and you've been burdened with that cost and you paid for it. So I don't know if that's a different way to look at it.
So the PID follows the property, not the buyer.
Correct.
Specific to the property.
And I know earlier we talked about kind of property-specific debt and cross-collateralization. Again, with the PID, if I make my payment, I'm in good standing as far as the PID is concerned in paying off my property-specific debt. And I think it's important to also kind of note that a lot of communities have multiple phases of development. And, is a property owner that's looking to buy either in, the first phase or a future phase, are they going to be benefiting greater or less and ultimately paying more or less because of those assessments? And the answer is no. Because typically there are two components that make up that assessment. Let's just say this property that we're looking at is in the initial phase of a development. They're going to have their phase-specific costs, which are more the internal roads, sewer, drainage, things like that are just specific to that phase. They don't flow throughout the entire development as a whole. Those costs will be evaluated for the assessment. then also a portion of those major thoroughfares, the major sewer lines that benefit the entire community. So if there were 3 phases in this particular community, as an example, then each phase would get 1/3 of those major improvement costs, plus their phase-specific costs, and that makes up their portion. So that way, when the second phase comes online, they would just have their phase-specific, and then also their third or their share of those major improvements. So it's not allocated, it's not front-loaded to the first phase or back-loaded to the end phases. It's, and in theory, allocated equitably.
Oh, I have a question. Sure. So what happens if you're talking about the different phases of the development, like the first phase they build, the second phase they build, the third. What happens if they end up not building the third phase and they sell it off?
So typically, those major improvements that flow throughout the entire community, even though the third phase may not start paying their portion of those assessments, the developer, the cost of those is going to be needed up front. So the developers, there's typically a major improvement bonds that are issued or debt, and then the debt for the phase-specific costs. So the developer at that point is still going to be making those payments on those future phase improvements regardless. So if it does not materialize, the developer is going to be on the hook, or whoever that property owner is at that time, for those annual installments regardless. They just wouldn't have their phase cost because they did not get to that point yet. But as far as, it would not be passed on to, back to the first or second phase because their assessment level was set. It was capped at this number at the start. They've been making their annual installment payments, and that's been reducing each year. It cannot increase. If it were to increase, they would have to have the assessment levy process occur all over again and receive greater than 50% of the property owner's approval in order for it to have an additional levy, which I would be willing to bet would not occur. So there is that protection as well, that those costs are going to be paid by the, in that case, the developer, more than likely. A common question we also receive from homeowners is, what is the tax rate of the PID? Or, and the easy answer is, and also a tough answer, is that it's not a tax rate. It's allocated based on typically an equivalent unit, like the square foot of the lot, or maybe the front foot of the lots. So typically, a 50-foot lot is going to receive a proportionally smaller amount of assessment than a 60-foot lot, with the theory that the larger lot is benefiting more from those improvements, therefore they should be responsible for a slightly larger amount of that assessment.
Is that the same with the mod?
No, except Laura.
It would probably play out similar just because their assessed values may change, but it would be a little, again, it wouldn't be as defined.
So the cost, you said, was based on the width of the lot, not the depth? So it's not the total lot size?
It depends. Each district will have their own parameters. Typically, the most common may be like a front foot or total square foot. Those are the most common. But there are a variety of other factors that could be used. As long as the city and the developer are comfortable with that and feel that it's equitable, then they can be used as well. But those would be the two most common. So regarding the tax rate, as I said, it's not impacted by assessed value. However, you're able to just back into that tax rate equivalent and provide that information. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just with the caveat that this is not actually how it's going to be billed. So in 1 year, if it was 25 cents, the impact the next year does not mean it's going to necessarily be 25 cents. And I think it's important just to note that because hopefully their home value would increase each year moving forward. And then if that occurs, then their tax rate impact is going to go down. Your traditional ad valorem taxes, if the tax rate stays the same, that impact is going to go up. But the PID, because it doesn't change based on the value, it would start to go down from an impact standpoint.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So we're going to jump ahead for a second. and then wrap up with this comparative schedule. So one thing that's happening, particularly here in Collin County, which is why we wanted to add this at the end of our presentation here, is the concept of a tax increment reinvestment zone overlay. And I think TIRs have prevalently been used in the state of Texas for years. Typically, you see them with commercial districts because the city is foregoing their general fund tax revenue for properties within a specific boundary to help, again, facilitate the financing of public infrastructure. However, we've seen a trend change in the state, and particularly here in DFW, because whereas typically they are created for commercial districts, and the rationale is that if a city forgoes a portion of their general fund tax increment revenue for a district, they're still going to receive additional revenues from commercial development, sales tax revenues, maybe this is personal property tax revenues, transfer tax revenues, etc., or hotel occupancy is another one for a commercial district. So enough other revenues to offset the cost of services required for that specific project. So police, sewer, or I'm sorry, police, fire, and education being a big one. And so typically they don't use TIRs when there's a ton of residential because revenues may be forgone for residential school for the students within that school. That being said, we're finding within this area that because of the nature of the infrastructure and the cost associated with it, sometimes that burden that we see with the special assessment is simply too high to finance all of the infrastructure required. Again, the tool, the PID, is not meant to fully offset all of the costs, but the developer needs to know that they're going to make some form of reasonable profit off of their deal to go forward, so it's striking that balance. However, oftentimes we're finding these municipalities want the infrastructure. So we determine what is that special assessment burden, and then we add that credit in the form of a tax increment revenue around the same district, which I will turn to him in a second. But the true rationale of placing this TIRs over a PID is so that we can raise more capital for the infrastructure up front, but maintain a reasonable tax burden to that homeowner.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, whether it's a MUD, a PID, they still have to be in the constraints of whatever that tax rate equivalent market value is. So that's considered especially much more on the origination end with Lindsay, and seeing that is it $2.60? Is it $3? What's that number in this given area? And making sure if the cost of the improvements are going to put that at about 3.25, then there might have this TIRs in play as another financing tool to help reduce it down to a level where those properties could be sold and those property owners could buy those houses. But it's just as far as a few the implementation and how that's going to impact a prospective property owner. Essentially, there's a one-year lag with a potential TIRs credit. So, for an example, if this year my PID annual installment was going to be $2,000 prior to any credit, and the city that I live in, they said, well, we're going to pledge 50% of your city ad valorem tax that you paid last year, and I paid $1,000, we'll pledge that back as a credit to you to help offset your PID annual installment. So now, instead of being billed $2,000, I'll be receiving a bill for $1,500, just that net amount. And that's not something that property owners have to apply for. It's not a refund or a rebate check that they have to receive where they have to pay $2,000 and then get the $500 back later. When we're preparing our budget and evaluating those taxes, we're also evaluating those city taxes typically that were levied and collected, and calculating that credit that's due to each property. So what the property owner would ultimately be billed each year is just that net amount.
Does a property owner who's a senior or disabled or a vet affect?
Yeah, that's a great segue. So for those individuals, since if they're exempt, whether it's fully exempt or partial exemption, that's going to impact their TERS credit because the revenue that their parcel or their property is generating would be reduced. So if they're fully exempt, then they would just be billed that full $2,000 because they did not generate any revenue from the city tax perspective in order for the city to issue a credit back to them. So there's no reason that they could not, or they'd be prevented from, purchasing a home in a community with a TERS, but they would just have a higher tax rate equivalent impact on for the PID portion than their neighbors who do pay city taxes.
It's the same for the mod, right? Because, for example, after 65, you can freeze your taxes here in Collin County.
Yeah, I'm not sure
That's not.
as far as I'm
That's just for your city.
And as far as the exemption itself, with the PID, that would also not apply as far as paying that assessment itself. So they would not be receiving that credit, and the PID also would not go away and be reduced if they're receiving a full exemption. They would still have that PID assessment. Their other ad valorem taxes may be zero, but they would still have that PID assessment. They're not exempt from that.
So all of these doesn't have those benefits what the city tax does.
So when I reference the city, it's a good question.
Yes.
Any taxing jurisdiction could participate in the TERS. So that typically in districts where we administer, it's just been the city that participates because they're the ones that would they're receiving the most benefit, they would want to see this development move forward. There are a few districts where perhaps a school district or a hospital or the county may also participate at a certain percentage. The city may participate at 50%, the county may participate at 25%. And that's going to be determined on that front end. Typically though, what we've seen so far is that it's just that city. So when they're looking at their potential credit, it's not, if their entire tax bill for ad valorem was $5,000, they would not be getting the credit based on that amount. It would just be for that city line item if that was the only participating jurisdiction.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So so you've got these MUDs and PIDs, and then you've got builders in there, and I guess we were at one of these meetings a couple of months ago where somebody brought up that there was a salesperson for a builder that sold 6 houses in a week. Remember?
Yeah.
And all but one of them ended up canceling because they were not aware of, they hadn't been versed on what was involved with this. And there's so much information. Do the builders, salespeople, are they versed on this? And how, because to me, this is so confusing.
So it's a great point. And as part of our role and with our fiduciary duties to the city, ultimately those citizens, those home buyers, we set up regular home buyer meetings, not just with you all, but also with builders to educate them. And with title company, anyone involved in the process, I typically don't like to just meet with just the builder sales representative. I would like to meet ideally with them, maybe their land manager, their preferred lender, anyone that's going to be involved in that process, because everyone has a little bit of a different angle as far as the information they may need and why they need it, and it's just beneficial for everyone to understand that process. With that being said, we schedule these meetings. At current, I can't force, and we cannot force the builder to present it. We strongly encourage it. What we have is a disclosure notice, and we request that they have those notice to purchaser that buyer would sign up front at contract, and then again made aware at closing. Unfortunately, sometimes that step may be missed, and they may not know about it until closing.
Well, there are forms you have to fill.
Yes.
We were a title company. Even some agents don't even know what those forms are.
Yes, and we prepare those forms. We have them available online for each district, and like I said, we follow up with each builder in each community to make sure that they are presenting that information, give them some bullet points as far as items like we're discussing today for sales and things like that. And at the end of the day, give them our business card so that they can refer anyone right straight to us and we can give them, you know, the information.
Yeah, and to that point, you know, as this tool becomes more prevalently used here in DFW, cities are now issuing RFP for services, for administrative services. And in those RFPs, to your point, one of the questions is, how can you help us mitigate and manage the home builders and home buyers to make sure that they're fully educated? So not only as a third-party administrator who's working on behalf of the city are we working to do that, or anyone else who fills the role of administrator, but the cities obviously see that as a true need to make sure that their constituents and the builders who are working within their cities are becoming more educated on how they do that. So I think where historically it's not legally required, but it's improving, I think the continue for best practice to push towards that is absolutely there as this grows. So with that, we have this comparative kind of wrap up of what we talked about. I don't necessarily think we need to go down through here, but it provides a good comparison of each of the qualities that we've talked about. But based on timing, I thought maybe we'd open up for any other questions. I know you guys have been really great at asking as things have come along, but if you have any additional questions, we're happy to answer.
Do you get the question a lot about a private transfer tax? Because I know that this isn't, but I think a lot of people, when they're transferring the cost of the tax to the next buyer, of course they're illegal in the state of Texas, private transfer tax. But this is not one because it's a municipal tax, correct? Or it's a bond. So, because that was another question somebody asked when they were talking about this. Well, how can that be, how can you transfer that cost on to the next buyer?
So typically in a lot of times where there may be a proration or something like that, the information that we'll provide is, here was the current cycle that we're in, assessment cycle, here was the amount that was due, you can confirm if that's been paid, and then provide the dates for the time period which that assessment covers. And then at that point, the proration, if that would be between the buyer and the seller at that point as far as some private negotiation. But as far as providing the information so that those, that proration can occur, we certainly, handle those inquiries, provide that information so that they have that available.
And to that point, just kind of recapitulating, and this gentleman had asked the question earlier in terms of it's a lien on the land, the assessment is, that is, and so it's transferable with any sale until it's been fully paid or the debt has been retired. And when it is transferred, and to what Josh just communicated, part of what is communicated in that transaction is, one, the prorated amount, but two, the year in which it's expected to expire based on the maturity of the debt.
But it's not private because the developer didn't issue the bond. It's actually a bond that's issued by
the city.
City. Okay, so that's why it's not a private transfer.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Because people asked that question and I didn't know, and then we asked somebody else and they said it's not private. But that makes more sense the way you said it. Okay.
So do you guys never get an established HOA that says, we'd really like to have, fiber optics, maybe concrete streets instead of blacktop? Do you ever go in retro and do that?
We have not, no. I mean, and HOA fee is separate of the assessment, and that's because it's more private in nature. We can't finance gas or dry utilities because though they're utilities and we see them and think of them as public, they are not in nature because they're privately managed and operated. So that's typically paid with HOA fees. And that's not just here in Texas, that's nationally. Any other questions? Thanks for your time today.